My name's Robyn Williams, and I have lived and worked in the Northern Territory for the better part of 35 years, probably a bit more. I first went to Darwin to do my nursing training over 35 years ago, nearly 36, because I had an interesting but useless arts degree. Didn't want to be an anthropologist, still don't. I wanted to do something that was both practical and useful, being a third generation do-gooder. And that seemed to be the best and quickest way to do it, because in those days nurses were the main workforce apart from the Aboriginal health workers. So I did that for a few years, came back into Darwin and did my graduate diploma of education, went back out bush teaching, then combined both of those at what was Bachelor College, teaching Aboriginal health workers, writing the original Aboriginal health worker courses and teaching those for a few years. So it all came together like some grand plan, but it wasn't actually. But I think it was also a matter of knowing what I didn't want to do, but broadly where I was working. So I'm now coordinating the Bachelor of Health Sciences at Charles Darwin University, and again, that's another nice sort of amalgamation of my experiences and my time. And one of those units is rural and remote health, which I just love. There's a lot of differences, and I think probably the main thing, at least for me, and people that thrive in those situations, is the fact that in a rural and remote context, you have the opportunity to develop relationships and engage with the community. In fact, it would be really hard to avoid that in a rural and particularly in a remote context. In an urban context, you tend to be in your little work bubble and then your home or your social life bubble. And the two don't often connect. It's easy to stick with your own kind in a sort of an urban context. Number one, know who you are and have a strong sense of self, like know exactly who you are. And that doesn't necessarily mean knowing where you come from or how old you are, or, not the sort of that prosaic stuff, but more knowing who you are, your professional, cultural identity. And that's really important because things tend to be heightened in a rural or remote context. And you need to know who you are because you'll be thrown into situations where you need to be able to fall back and know yourself and be strong. You need to be strong to be an independent and effective and certainly a culturally safe practitioner. It's absolutely crucial. So that would be the first thing, would be to know yourself and know who you are. Secondly, it would be to find a bit about the place where you're going. Do your homework, do a bit of research, get to know the history, like is it a mining community, a farming community, a mixture of hippies and farmers and rural politicians that only visit come election time, or is it an Indigenous community? Was it a mission or a government reserve? So just get to know a little bit about it so you know what you're getting yourself in for. So you don't get there and find out, much to your shock and dismay, that there are no caravan parks or hotels or shops with interesting little bits and pieces in there. The third thing would be to mind your manners, and by that I mean be respectful. Most of the things that you will think of when you go out there, people will have done before or at the very least thought of. So it's part of finding out the history, but be respectful of other people. They might not do or think or look the same as you, but nonetheless, mind your manners and be respectful. And listen. Shut up and listen. I think that would be my third piece of advice, something I found surprisingly easy to do. One of the ones that was sort of the most salutary for me in terms of going, aha, having a little epiphany was many years ago, probably about 15 years ago. I was on a remote Indigenous community about 500 k's northeast of Darwin, a big community, about 3,000 people. I was working with a couple of women who were managing a diabetic support group, a support group for people with diabetes. We were going up to the other end of the island that was about, 2 or 3 hours drive. Somehow I ended up driving the big troop carrier, and amazingly enough, we started with 3 people and ended up with about 15, and including my 2 kids. Well, they were always coming with me, but we went. Anyway, driving, get to this big, what we call jump up, bit of over a sandy rise. Bang, straight into this wallaby. Killed it. I was traumatised. I was vegetarian. My eldest son was traumatised because he hated seeing things hurt, and but the rest of the people in the, who were involved, who were there, was so happy. And that story is still told today. How finally, after all those years, Robyn did something useful, and that was a real wake. I thought they were just laughing at me, which they were. But finally, and I got. The council president came around and he said, "Finally, Yuppa, you're doing something useful. Thank you." And I went, okay, if I'd known that was easy, I would have run over a few kangaroos earlier. When I realised reasonably early on, actually, I know very little. And certainly by the end of my time, spending concerted, like long amounts of time in rural and remote communities, I realised that I actually knew less than when I started. And I think that was probably a key moment, which is a good thing because it takes the pressure off, and it also means that I think non-Indigenous people have a shelf life in Indigenous communities, and it's a bit like a celebrity sports star. You need to know when it's time to go, when it's time to retire. And also the other thing that came with that was I knew that leaving a particular community wasn't the end of my relationships. We've had long, many decades, like 3 decades of family connections with many communities, and we still have those connections. And it's really, one of my favourite brothers is a Yolngu man from one of the communities, and my kids grew up out in these places. They've had experiences that no one else would have. In fact, I think the youngest, even at 21, is convinced, well, he's not convinced that he's not Aboriginal, but just because that's the way he was brought up. Being a culturally safe practitioner is about, first and foremost, knowing who you are and the impact of that on the people that you're engaging with, whether it's working or they're your clients or it's just on a day-to-day interaction. So knowing who you are and the impact of that. So you may be, so for example, I was brought up as I'm a 3rd-generation do-gooder. I'm also a Collingwood tragic, for those of you who know or care about AFL. That absolutely has an impact on who I am and the way that I can engage with people. I remember going out to a community, one Indigenous community once, many years ago, and the entire community were Collingwood fans. I went, yes, give me a job, I'm coming to work here. Knowing who you are and the impact that has. And I think also, in order to be a culturally safe practitioner, you have to be respectful. That can be really hard because not everybody's nice, and not every person that you're meeting with and engaging with is going to give you the same courtesy and be respectful to you, particularly if you're in a sort of a stressful or an acute clinical situation. It can be really hard to be nice to someone and be respectful and acknowledge what they bring to the table. And I had, can I just give you a classic example? When I was teaching the Aboriginal Project Officers course, it was mostly urban Aboriginal people, and I'm an interactive teacher, and I'd say to them, okay, so what do you think? And this young man who'd come in from one of the mining communities, Aboriginal man, was earning a mozza, like a lot more money than I was as a mechanic, came in to do the course because he wanted to sort of change his work, and he just slammed his fist down on the table and he said, I didn't come to university to be asked what I think. You need to tell me. That's your job. And I thought, okay, and here was I thinking I was being culturally safe, but no, I hadn't actually engaged the person, the recipient, in the sort of care or the sort of education that they wanted. And that for me was it was a big moment. And that was when I first really started thinking about, okay, it doesn't matter if you're teaching, nursing, landscape gardening, how do you work in a culturally safe manner? So it's actually engaging with the person and negotiating that with them. I think it's absolutely critical. Certainly as health professionals, we're taught, and particularly if you're a medical practitioner, you're taught that you've got the answers and you've got to give and tell people what to do. And I think it's unlearning that in many ways and taking that on board.